I'm here with Tom Fletcher, the principal of Hertford College at Oxford University. Thank you, Tom, first of all, for allowing us to come here to Oxford to interview you for the 2022 Rising Global Peace Forum.
You're most welcome, Richard. It's great to see you. I'm only sorry to everyone in Coventry today that I can't be with you in person because I have a family funeral, but it's terrific to have this chance to support an absolutely brilliant event, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Excellent. Tom, as you know, our theme at Rising this year is digital peace. Before we get on to talk about that and what you see as the role of education in this digital age, and also I think we'll get on to discuss education's role in developing, I think, what you call global competence, and how that can help build and sustain peaceful communities. Perhaps you can start by sharing with our audience a little bit about how you came to be here at Hertford College in Oxford.
Well, I suppose it's quite a circuitous journey. I mean, I started as a student here. Let's see, maybe I shouldn't put a number on it, but it's towards 30 years ago. I was actually rejected at first, my first time round by Oxford. Much of my career in life has been a series of failures, actually. I was a failed boxer, I was a failed lead singer in a band, I was a failed teacher, I was a failed Oxford applicant, and a failed door-to-door salesman in America. But tried those various things and then ended up in diplomacy when I left Oxford, and had this fascinating career. I mean, I was so privileged to work in Kenya and in Paris and around the world for the Minister for Africa, working at Number 10 as the foreign policy advisor, and then at the age of 36 going out to Lebanon as our youngest ever senior ambassador. And I suppose that journey eventually led me back to Hertford and this idea, which I'm sure we'll touch on today, of education as upstream diplomacy. And in a way, education and learning was always there as a theme in the background to all that work, and eventually brought me back here to Hertford College.
So, I guess to be 36 and the youngest ever ambassador, that's a stellar career by any stretch. I know it may have started off with a few failures. Did you see your job within the context of, as a diplomat, of trying to create a more equal and just world in some way, rather than just is the wrong word, rather than being the representative of Her Majesty's government as if there was?
Yes. I think there's a spectrum when it comes to diplomats, and at one end of the spectrum, probably where I am, there are a group of us who are quite idealistic about the role of diplomacy in society and the way it acts as a lubricant almost between countries and ideas and trends, to try to avoid and minimise conflict, to try and improve the chances of peace and security for people. So I guess there is that idealistic approach to it. I think the great dividing line of the 21st century is between people like Donald Trump, who think that the answer to every challenge that we face is to build a bigger wall. We have some of those in our own government at the moment. And people like me, and I imagine many of those in Coventry today, who believe that we need to work on coexistence, that actually the magic comes in that interplay between cultures and societies. And diplomacy is a key part of that. At the other end of the spectrum, there is a much more realist approach to classic diplomacy, what used to be called kind of maps and chaps, flags and protocol. And of course, that's a huge part of what a diplomat does. You're promoting your nation's, your state's values, prosperity, security. But I think alongside that, there is space for idealism too.
And are you still an idealist?
Yes, I am. A lot of people said to me that going to Lebanon would knock the idealism out of me. I'd become a bit less zealous. And actually it did the opposite. It made me more worldly wise, probably, a bit more aware of the cost when we get this wrong. And of course the Syria conflict was just up the road. Literally, I lived on the road to Damascus. 1 hour up the road, it was all happening. And so you see the worst of humanity, but you also see the best of humanity in those situations. And so, it will take more than that to knock the idealism out of me.
Excellent. Was it this idealism that sort of prompted your career move from the diplomatic service into education?
Yes, I think it probably was. So two things really happened towards the end of my time in Lebanon. One was the rise of populism, Trumpism, that sense of the centre ground getting weaker.
This was when, 2000, excuse me?
So 2015 or so
15, yeah.
when I left. And I could see that polarisation in the Middle East. But the language that was being used to radicalise young people across the Middle East was exactly the same language that Donald Trump and others were using in our own societies. We can make you great again. We can take you back to a time when you had more dignity, when those people who look a bit less like us weren't around complicating things. It was that sort of language. And I felt that I needed to be in that argument. And I needed to make the case for diplomacy in that argument, which is why I wrote The Naked Diplomat. But I had to leave diplomacy, ironically, to write that book. But also, during my time in Lebanon, by the time I left, a third of the people in Lebanon were Syrian refugees. Wow. This is very relevant to the debates we're having at the moment about the migrants arriving in Kent, for example. And you could see the challenges for society in adapting to that changed demographic. And a huge part of that was that we had 1 million Syrian kids out of school. And whatever your position on who caused the Syrian war, whether we could have done more to avert it, the extent to which it's Putin, the extent to which we should have found some way to deal with Assad and his regime earlier. Putting all those aside, it should not be those 1 million kids that were paying the price for our collective diplomatic failures. And so I went to work at that stage with the Global Business Coalition for Education, the work of Gordon and Sarah Brown on global education, amazing, groundbreaking work that they're doing.
Brown has actually spoken at Rising, the first one back in 2015.
Good.
Yes.
I bet he gave a barnstorming
speech.
He did
indeed, yes.
It's, this is a passion for him. And it's amazing when you look at what prime ministers do after being prime minister, especially with younger and younger incumbents in the job. Gordon has consistently been working on education, and he's still, yesterday he phoned me 3 times about Afghanistan and girls' education. And, how can we, what can we do? What can we do with the Gulf states? What can we do to raise more money? What can we do to raise the profile in our own media? So, this stuff keeps him awake at night, and I think that's pretty impressive. But that was a move for me out of diplomacy into that space around how do we support that group of Syrian refugees, and then how do we then think about the 75 million out of school more widely. And I had one moment in a refugee camp where I was meeting someone, and as ambassador you travel around in this convoy of great big kind of 4-wheel drive and lots of security and so on. It's very difficult to have meaningful conversations really in the midst of that. But I had one conversation with Zainab, who was 12, who was bringing herself up, desperate to go to school. She pointed to her brother and said, he shouldn't be drawing rockets that are landing on his head. He's drawing these stick men and stick rockets and so on. He wants to go to space. He should be thinking about rocket science and so on. And I didn't really know what to say as an ambassador, but as I left, she said, what do we really need to learn? And that's a very profound question, because we don't need to learn the same things. That generation does not need to learn the same things that our generation learned. It's a completely different set of skills, and so that was part of the journey for me.
I think I read somewhere you were described as the anti-diplomat. I think it was. I'm not quite sure what that meant. And I think it was whilst you were in Lebanon, you got involved in setting up a tech hub in some way. And you also won the Lovey Special Achievement Award for use of social media at that time. How did that come about?
Well, I don't know quite how I ended up getting that award.
Ambassadors are on
No. And when I started, I think there were 4 of us on Twitter.
Right.
Of all the ambassadors. And then over time, that's obviously shifted. I imagine there are only 4 who aren't now on Twitter. I suppose I was an anti-diplomat in that I didn't have much patience for the protocol, the representational side of things. I hated all the kind of fluffy platitudes about I'm here to build warm bilateral relations in a range of fields. Meaningless stuff that actually I always thought was a barrier between diplomats and the people we're there to serve. And social media was a great opportunity to try and explain in a different way what we were doing. But also at that time, with Arab Spring taking off across the region, it was the best way I had to connect with young people. And for the first time in history, I didn't just have to speak to the elites of Lebanon. I was able to speak to the population at large there and across the region. I mean, what an opportunity. And it was very, very exciting. And in those days, there were very few rules. I remember one minister in London basically said to me, you can do whatever you want as long as you don't get into the UK media.
This was a coalition government at that time, was it?
It would have been, yes.
Yeah.
And one minister who was quite jealous of my social media numbers said, just don't get into the UK media. I thought, that's fine, there's plenty of other media to get into. But it had to be used as a tool. It wasn't just a gimmick. It couldn't just be stunts. We're not there to be comedians or we're not there to be I'm a celebrity contestants. We're there to promote our own country's values, and that's what we're trying to do. And it was a real risk. This, this smartphone, perhaps not literally this one, it was probably an earlier model, was this massive opportunity for me, in that it was the way I could connect with hundreds of thousands of young people in the region. But it was also a risk. It was the device that terrorists were using to track my movements. And so my bodyguards hated it. And I'd have to, follow various restrictions on how I could tweet and so on. But I'd always say to the ambassadors who talked a lot to me about the risks, we're much more cautious. The greatest risk is not to be on there in that conversation, especially at a time when people are being radicalised on there. And we have to put the other side. So I just mentioned two quick anecdotes from the social media. So I did lots of blogging and so on, and I wrote a letter to Lebanon that sort of went everywhere in Lebanon. And now, if ever I am hungry or run out of money anywhere in the world, I just find the nearest Lebanese restaurant and walk in, and they'll say, Mr. Ambassador, welcome back, because of that letter. But we were trying to use social media to challenge people. And so, for example, I wanted to run a campaign on why we needed to treat migrant workers with more dignity. And rather than do a speech or write an article which no one would read, I became a domestic worker. But more importantly, Kalkidan Negusi, an 18-year-old Ethiopian, became the ambassador. So we swapped jobs. And the photos of me as a domestic worker went viral, but also more importantly, Kalkidan walked out in front of the region's media after our meeting with the Interior Minister and just said, you've got to start treating us with dignity and respect. Brilliant. Led the news.
Yeah. That's a very different sort of diplomat to the tradition.
There were lots of people who hated it. But that was fine. The right people hated it. Another sort of experiment at the time was that for much of my time there, I wasn't allowed to have contact with the Iranian ambassador. We had no relationship because they burnt down our embassy in Tehran. And this was quite complicated. When he turned up at a reception, I was meant to adopt a hostile demeanour, which, as you can probably guess, I'm not really very good at doing hostile demeanour. I used to practice it in the mirror. I couldn't get there.
They don't train you in that.
They don't train us in that. But there was an awful moment when there was a terrorist attack against his embassy. And the classic thing you do as a diplomat is you go and express condolences. And it's a human way. You literally reach out and connect. And I wasn't allowed to do that because I wasn't allowed to have a relationship, a human relationship. We'd cut that. And so instead I went down and donated blood outside the embassy. And the photo of that went then viral in Iran. And I'm not saying for a moment there's a connection between that and the nuclear deal that we did 2 years later, the classic diplomacy that we were doing with Iran. But it did challenge people at a time when they were being told that the Brits are the little Satan. The Americans are the big Satan, the Brits are the little Satan. I was just trying to show that actually there is a human connection that is still there.
Yeah, it's interesting, a couple of points. At Coventry University, one of our big research projects is on South-South migration. Massive £20 million project, and it's called the MIDEC programme, and part of that has been looking at the power of digital media for migrant communities moving through various corridors and how it can tell their story off the back of that. There was an interesting piece, Richard Ratcliffe, husband of Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, speaking at Rising this year. He wrote in The Independent last week, I don't know if you saw it, a piece about, given all the fuss about, after the Molly Russell case and the takeover of Twitter, where people are expressing concern about digital media, he was saying how, as a force for good, it should not be discounted at all. And he was writing about how, in keeping the case of his wife, and they were, again, not quite giving blood, but when he went on hunger strike outside the Foreign Office, you probably recall the pictures there, and he was there for about 3 weeks, I think. to maintain that story out there, reaching a far bigger audience.
It's so powerful. And I think I was, in this respect, like most probably, I was too idealistic. And I used to go around the Middle East in the early days of social media saying the most powerful weapon in the region is the smartphone. You know, a great line for Twitter. Actually, not true, because we found, obviously, in my time there that the chemical weapons of Assad had more power. That the threat of nuclear weapons from Iran had more power. That the bombs that Putin was dropping on people's houses had more power. And it's not enough just to do the social media, but the social media can change attitudes, can change history. And I think in the medium to long term, I hope I'll still be right, that actually it gives us this way to connect. One of my favourite clips from TV of all time is at the end of that fantastic documentary, Jacob Bronowski, The Ascent of Man.
He stands in the puddle.
Yes, at Auschwitz.
Yeah.
And he literally lifts up a part of the puddle where his relatives have died. He just says, we have to reach out and touch people. And it's quite clunky, the film isn't, but it slows down. And you just get this very profound moment of this nuclear scientist who has been through so much and has so much wisdom, and yet at the heart of it, we need to reach out and touch people. And that, in a way, is where I think the great power is with social media.
You mentioned the book, which I think came out, was it 2016? You'd probably been writing it 12, 18 months before, The Naked Diplomat. And I think Gordon Brown described you as a diplomatic genius or something. That says, this was about power, statecraft in a digital age. Yeah. What was the main sort of thrust of the book? Were you trying to change the culture in the Foreign Office and in the government at the time?
Yeah. I mean, I suppose the underlying political point is we've got to be in the argument. And diplomacy has always adapted. It's Darwinian. It's adapted to the technological change all around it. But it can't just adapt the tools. It's not just about using the smartphone. It's about understanding how the internet is changing society around us and being an active participant in trying to change society for the better. And diplomacy, of course it was different when horseback riding started or when the television was invented. Telegram. And Palmerston looked at the telegram and said, my God, it's the end of diplomacy. And when the fax machine came along, someone said, you can replace the Foreign Office with the fax. And so every time a new technology has come along, someone has said, right, that's it, we don't need diplomats anymore. Leaders can WhatsApp each other directly. And diplomats have had to adapt. And so I was making the case, we have to adapt, we have to use these new tools, but underneath that, there's that broader political case that actually we have to hold the centre ground. The centre has to hold. And we have to create this space where, I called it the grey zone in the book. Islamic State talk about the grey zone. It's when they attack, the terrorist attacks that were taking place in Nairobi and Paris and Beirut, 3 cities I know very, very well, were attacks on the grey zone. They were attacking interaction between different cultures and societies and ideas. They weren't just attacking the West or Christianity.
The Vatican, for example.
The Vatican, exactly. And those are the spaces that the rest of us have to defend. And it's not enough just to assume that history ended in 1989 and everything is moving in our direction. Berlin Wall's come down, ended apartheid. Brilliant, it's all working. This is the new normal now. We have to fight for that space.
Interesting. So you left Lebanon in 2016.
2015.
2015. Yeah. You were a visiting professor, if I'm right, in New York.
Yes.
For a while. And you set up a network called Towards Global Learning Goals. Was that right?
Yeah.
But by this stage, you left diplomacy for good, as far as you were concerned, and education was where you. So
education was becoming more magnetic, I guess. I don't think I've left diplomacy yet. I still write on the landing cards on the planes, diplomat, when it says what's your profession. But I write it with a small d, not a capital D. I still hope that some of what I'm doing, at least, is diplomacy of a kind. But yeah, so I went in. I had this.
As an anecdote, Geoffrey Boycott, the cricketer, always used to write businessman.
Did he?
On his landing cards.
He was a pretty good businessman, wasn't he? The Global Learning Goals project was fascinating. I was at a conference on the future of education, and I was there to talk about Syrian education. And I did a sort of side event, and it was quite a quiet side event, not many people there. And sort of slightly despondently finished it and wandered off thinking, oh, well, on we go, keep trying. And someone came up to me and said, what would you, if you could work on anything, what would it be? And I said, I'd work on the curriculum of the future. What should young people be learning? How can we ensure that young people aren't learning the wrong things in the wrong ways? And she said, well, what would you need to do that? And I said, I'd probably need a couple of months and a little bit of funding. And she said, take 2 years and we'll fund it.
Wow.
And the Porticus Foundation, who are a terrific educational charity, backed me basically to go out and have that conversation with world leaders, with businesses, with young people, with refugees, and to try to shape the future of the curriculum. And that was really behind it. What should the global learning goals be? And how do we take education back actually to being about head, hand and heart, knowledge, skills and values? And so that became, we did that piece of work, and eventually that became a book I wrote called 10 Survival Skills for a World in Flux, which is really trying to think about not actually just the skills and values that kids need, although of course they do, but actually that we all need. And I think we saw during COVID that our leaders actually need empathy, emotional intelligence, curiosity about the world to a much greater extent than they currently have.
So, yes, it's interesting. We sit in this age of greater connectedness, more connectedness than ever. I don't know whether you say we're past the dawn of the age of artificial intelligence or we're still in the dawn. But I think you call this global competence. I wonder if you could just say a bit more about what you mean by that.
Yeah, so global competence is a concept worked on mainly by the OECD. Fantastic German data scientist called Andreas Schleicher, who's pioneered much of the thinking on this. Andreas was actually the guy behind many of the league tables that compared schools and countries. And I think in Andreas's mind, that led to too much focus on exam results. And he thought, well, how can we try and create a similar excitement about...
Was he behind the PISA?
Yes, exactly. And so he was thinking, how can we actually develop a broader range of skills? And that's where global competence came from. For me, global competence is, can I take that individual and drop them in Bahrain or Beijing or Birmingham, and they will have the antennae to adapt. They'll be curious about the world around them. They'll ask the right questions. They'll understand that theirs is not the only filter on the world. Like an Instagram filter, you've got to learn, this is a great superpower really. Understand the filters of other people, but also understand your own filter. That to me is global competence. So a lot of it is about emotional intelligence, about empathy. And they're often called 21st century skills. To me, that's diplomacy. Those are classic diplomatic skills. And I suppose in a way, I spend a lot of time in diplomacy trying to get more technology and more education into diplomacy. Part of my journey now is trying to get more diplomacy into education and more diplomacy into technology.
And this is not just something that's a Western concept, because I think Chinese, Jack Ma, for example, has been very interested in this, isn't it?
Jack Ma's brilliant on this stuff. And he said, I did an event with him in Paris, and he said to me that the problem with most university degrees is it's really just the invoice for the education you've had. It's not actually then going to take you out into the world to live a life of purpose and impact. And so one of the things we've done here at Hertford is we developed a course called Head, Hand and Hertford, which actually focuses on these skills. It focuses on these sorts of values and skills. I mean, we've got some of the smartest kids in the world here, and some of the most extraordinary academics. Brilliant work. Philosophy, AI, physics, astrophysics, across the piece. But I'm also keen that they leave here with that broader set of skills as well, so that we can be a frontline for a better society. And you're right that this isn't just some sort of Western concept. Many of the countries now doing the most interesting innovation in this space are our nation.
And you also mentioned the fact that this is not just something for people going through the learning process up to, say, 25. This is a lifelong learning, almost challenging our thinking about what it means to be human, about how to relate to people who aren't like us, about cultural literacy, about the way we see the world, rather than necessarily being focused on content.
Yes. So yeah, it develops the idea really. Einstein said, "Don't learn anything you can read in a book. Don't memorize anything you can read in a book." And in a way, you could say, "Don't memorize stuff that you can look up on Wikipedia." And we put such a premium on exams, sort of factory model, where we say to kids, "Don't work together. Work on your own. Memorize this stuff." Short-term memory is prioritized. When actually, when they go out into the real world, we say, "Work in a team." And go out and find the information you need and curate it, put it together. So it's finding ways to reward that much more. But also, I think these three big trends we've got at the moment are the rise of distrust, the rise of inequality, and this technological the acceleration around us that will mean we'll go through in the next century as much technological change as in the last 43. It's like going from cave paintings to driverless cars in the lifetime of our kids. And so how do we ensure that the machines work for our kids and our kids don't work for the machines? And ultimately, that means focusing on what it means to be human. What sets us apart from the robots, from the machines, from AI. And for me, I collected a book of advice for my son over many years in Number 10 from world leaders. Everyone, from Barack Obama, George Bush, Mandela, Tutu, they're all in there. It's extraordinary. Obama looked at it and said, Charlie will either be very rich or very clever, depending on whether he sells it or reads it. But actually, if you just distill all that advice, it comes down to three things: be kind, be curious, be brave. And the kindness will need to take on this inequality around us. The curiosity will need to deal with these massive challenges: AI, huge migration, the next pandemic, the next global crash, new weapons. But we'll also have to be brave because, as I say, this is the new normal. The world isn't going to suddenly reset to a time before 2015 when I can poodle off back to diplomacy and everything's nice and warm and cozy again. This is a generational struggle now for coexistence.
And I guess two questions sort of spring to mind. One is about how do we test for that global competence, and also how do we ensure that people focus on developing those skills that you've spoken about, so that they're not on the wrong side of the dividing line.
Yeah, it's really important. So I think the testing bit of it is tough. And of course, until you have got a way to assess it, then actually governments, parents, universities, and I sort of speak in some way as a constituent of all three of those, won't take it seriously. Because universities still want to measure how many A-levels you've got. Parents will still be thinking, yeah, this is all very good, maybe useful life skills, but how does little Johnny get into university? They need the same qualifications we got. My son's taking tests today and I'm taking them very seriously at school.
But employers may start to look for...
Employers will. My hope is that employers will start to do that and that the young people themselves will drive that change. But you've got to have some form of assessment so that people take it more seriously and governments take it more seriously. And you can do that. So, for example, you can run an assessment. You could take the top story on the BBC website. Say, for example, it's migrants arriving in Kent today. And you can try to understand the perspective of the person on the other side of the argument. And so you can model that conversation. What is the context for the migrant arriving? What is the context for someone in Dover who's worried about their own livelihood? What is the context for a government minister or an opposition minister? You can try and zoom out and assess what different people would think in that conversation. And that's a big part of developing that empathy and emotional intelligence.
I remember one of our prime ministers, recent ones, I know there have been several, who should remain nameless, said, a citizen of everywhere is a citizen of nowhere. And how do we, irrespective actually of how old we are, make that connection between the local and the global? Yes, I accept that people at Hertford College and people at Coventry University will, in their working life, be global. But how do we make that connection also with what's going on in their local community?
Yeah, it's so important. I remember that was one of the lines in all my time observing government in the last few years that got me most angry. Because I don't think you have to choose between the two things. I think you have to have a global perspective, and it's vital we develop that in our young people. But you shouldn't detach that from being from somewhere, from caring about your local community. I spend a lot of time working on global competence with our students here, but equally we spend a lot of time working on how to become a better neighbour to Oxford, to the colleges around us, the communities around us, the people facing different kinds of challenges on our doorstep. And so I do think the two things are very compatible. And it was a very unfortunate phrase, really. But I suspect that Prime Minister regrets that line now.
Yes, I think if the Dean of Coventry Cathedral, I'm sure he will frequently preach on the parable of the Good Samaritan, for example, and there was the neighbour. That was where the community was. But the community is now also online as well, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's been a challenge for me on my journey in a way. The work I was doing after Lebanon on global education was all big numbers. 75 million kids out of school, a million Syrians out of school. How do we raise this number of millions? It all felt very detached from individuals. And this work is the opposite of that, the work at a university, because actually, if I've done my work over the coming 7-8 years, maybe a decade here, who knows if they'll have me that long, it will really be about 100 or so small interventions in the lives of students or others. That's what will count at the end of that. And so it's a much more local.
Interesting. Rising is, as you know, is based in Coventry. Coventry, the UK's only city of peace and reconciliation because of what happened on 15th of November 1940. It's also one of the UK's most diverse cities, and actually that was one of the reasons it got the City Culture Award. More than 10 years ago, I think, in the 2011 census, identified that 30% of the population of Coventry was minority ethnic background. In the schools, over 100 languages are spoken. What role would you see in a place like Coventry, for example, in enabling and encouraging us to learn about creating a more just, peaceful world, about achieving this global competence? What would be your message?
It's a great challenge. But so I think, I'm doing this work at the moment here. We've set up a diplomacy centre, and that we're thinking about what are the peace processes of the future. Right. What will the Nobel Prizes for Peace be awarded for in 2030? And my hypothesis is that there will be great peacemakers in the field of making peace between humans and the planet. How do we coexist with nature? There will be great peacemaking on future conflicts that we haven't anticipated yet. Many of them climate-driven conflicts, as millions of people move. There will be a peace process, talking of the theme of the conference really, around peace between humans and big technology. How do we sit down and do the peace process with Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and so on, the new emperors? Vital work. There'll be peace with technology itself. How do we coexist with artificial intelligence? Whose ethics do we give AI? How do we protect the rules that guarantee our liberty and our security in an internet age? But there'll also be, I think, peace prizes for those working on peace between local communities. And that will often be around very diverse, shifting populations. And these are tough issues. We can't just pretend it will be easy. And I think many on the right of the debate will try and define it as us and them, who gets what, gets very transactional. Many on the left of the debate will define it more by values, but will sometimes ignore the very real consequences for people's lives. It is a trade-off. If you have this number of school places, this amount of free housing, this number of hospital beds, and you have this number of people, then there are real trade-offs there. And there's vital practical work to do in that space to make peace between those communities in the right way. So for me, in a way that's diplomacy, but it's not diplomacy between states anymore, between people who stand in front of a flag and represent a monarch or a government. It'll be different kinds of diplomacy, but in a way it's too important to leave to diplomats. And so the work that you'd be doing in Coventry then is really on the front line of diplomacy. So I should call you Your Excellency.
This is the upstream diplomacy that you see education as being there. I wonder, looking, here we are, 2022, as you look around the world today, aside from Head, Heart and Hand at Hertford, where else in the world would you say is a model, is a beacon for this sort of thinking and work?
Wow, it's a good question. So I think if you look, for me, I mean, oddly enough, because Lebanon had been through so much, you could find this sort of thinking there. I mean, there's a brilliant NGO called Adian who were writing the coexistence curriculum, where they'd gone out and they'd worked with, and the UK Embassy, we funded this, they'd worked with 19 different religious groups, all of whom had their own schools. And in many of those schools, they were basically, I'm stereotyping a little bit, but they were teaching their own religion, and people were then drawing their own conclusions about other religions. The people down the road are different. They do things differently to us. And what they did that was so pioneering was to actually find a way to teach each other's religions. They agreed a common curriculum to describe each other's religions, which I think was an amazing step forward. So I think there's very interesting work there. I think there's lots of interesting work being done on our shared history. And it's contested space. It's all part of the culture war. And yet, I don't believe that our history is a list of the battles that we happen to win.
And the dates. Yeah.
And the dates. History is really about, of course, that's part of it, but it's all about how the things we did wrong as well, learning from those, but also about how we learn to live together in between those conflicts. Human society has advanced one sort of fireside chat, one small intervention, going back to my thought on the 100 interventions at a time. That's the real story of human history, alongside the sort of great battles and great individuals and emperors and wars and so on. So there's really interesting work being done in that space as well. And then I think a huge amount of that work is then being done at the local level. One of the most heartening things that I worked on in Number 10 was Northern Ireland. I had 4 years as the PM's Northern Ireland advisor. And I was doing...
who was Secretary of State then?
So I had several... Right. We had several... I was there 2007 to 2011.
So Peter Hain, who's speaking advising, was he Secretary of State?
So I didn't overlap with Peter in his time. Peter had played this absolutely crucial role, as you know, slightly earlier on in the process. But so in that role I was doing... well, actually I'm going to mention two stories, if I may. One, we were right in the midst of a negotiation. I won't mention the leaders, but senior Sinn Féin leaders, senior unionist leaders. And I had to break the meeting up because one of the leaders had lost his mother. And I had to break news and say, well, surely we'll stop the meeting now so you can go and be with your family. And up to that point, one of the guys around the table had refused to face that individual. He turned his chair away, turned his back, because of horrific things that happened in the past. And the guy who'd lost his mother said, it's more important I stay in this room and finish this conversation. And at that point, the other guy turned the chair around to face him, and we made progress. So, it's in those moments. The other thought, I was doing an event on peace and reconciliation with South Africans, Rwandans, Lebanese and others. And a couple arrived together, and I said to the lady, so why are you here? And she said, I'm here to speak because my father died in the Brighton bombing. And I'm here to say we've got to move on. We've got to find the courage to forgive. And what can you say other than say thank you? And I turned to the guy next to her and said, and you, sir, I thought it was her husband or brother or friend or somebody who just accompanied her. I said, why are you here, sir? And he said, I was the bomber. I was the guy that killed her father. And I'm here to talk about courage and forgiveness and the need to move on. And you can find those people everywhere. Maybe not with such dramatic stories, but people who are ready to perform this immense work of being a good ancestor. A huge part of that is understanding our legacy as individuals. What must we pass on? What values have we inherited that we absolutely must pass on? But also, what are the inequalities, injustices that we've inherited that we must not pass on? What must we filter out? And your event is doing that great work.
You spoke about education in this interview a lot. I'm conscious we've had, I think, 5 education secretaries in the past 6 years. The most recent, I think, appointed last month. What would be the number one priority that you would see for her?
It's a lot of churn, isn't it? That's a lot of turnover. It's one of the weaknesses in our system, actually, this very fast turnover of ministers. It means they don't get time to actually really get on top of the brief, to really set out a bit, to see through a vision. Always getting someone else turning up with their set of ideas. I'd love to see this focus on more towards head, hand and heart, and away from exams and factory schools and all that pressure on teachers. Teachers have to be a key part of that, by the way, because they have a better understanding of these challenges than any of us. So really focusing on what makes us human, creativity, empathy, emotional intelligence, I think would be terrific to see. I really hope that it won't happen overnight, this shift in education. But I really hope that the teacher of global history who's struggling to get global history on the curriculum can take heart from the NGO worker who's working on global competence with the local community. They can take heart from Elise, the French student I met in France, who's dropped out and is teaching the baccalaureate online to other students alongside life skills. They can take heart from what's happening around Jack Ma or around Andreas Schleicher. Somehow that we can join the dots between these different constituencies and eventually we sweep aside the mighty walls of institutional oppression.
Yes, that's some challenge. Finally, Tom, we're asking all our speakers at Rising and delegates there, what are your main hopes and fears for 2023?
Well, you've saved the easy one to last then. I really want to see progress in what I described as this peace process between governments and big tech, where at the moment we're not going to get the updates to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights in place in time to protect us from some of those challenges of the internet. I really want to see people bring the conversation back to climate change. And in the UK, we've become way too distracted. We're running around after these very short-term challenges and ignoring the fact that winter is very much coming. And am I allowed 3?
You are.
Sorry, it's like Desert Island Discs, and I'm changing the rules. And I would love to see education become the next great civil rights movement, and that young people themselves drive that change to ensure they're learning the right things in the right ways.
Well, maybe in 12 months' time we can go back and see how things have turned out.
You see if I'm still idealistic then.
No, I'm sure you will.
I still will be, but I may change my timescales a bit. I normally have to adjust those.
Tom Fletcher, thank you very much.
Thanks, Richard.